Welcome to True Crime Threads. Today we uncover a deadly affair that spirals into murder. In the affluent suburb of Oak Ridge, Natalie Turner was living a life many would envy. A successful businesswoman, she had it all: money, power, and luxury. But there was one thing missing: excitement. At 42, Natalie was bored with her predictable life. The days were filled with meetings, high-end shopping, charity events, and endless social gatherings, but nothing sparked joy like it once had. Her marriage had long since faded into a shadow of its former self, and her relationships with her friends were more about appearances than genuine connection. She had everything money could buy, yet the thrill of life had left her. It was a void she struggled to fill, even though she'd never admit it to anyone. It was during one of her routine home improvements that she first noticed Noah. He was the 24-year-old son of one of her longtime employees, a landscaper named Ray. He had just recently started helping out around her property, filling in for his father during the busiest times of the year. The young man was unlike anyone Natalie had encountered before. His presence was magnetic, charismatic, yet effortlessly humble, with an energy that seemed to radiate from him. Where others were content to pass the time with polite pleasantries, Noah seemed to have a spark, a vitality that caught her attention. Their interactions at first were small, brief exchanges in passing as she walked from her car to the front door, or when she checked in on the garden. He would smile politely, offering a few words of gratitude or an opinion on the weather, nothing out of the ordinary. Natalie had long since mastered the art of keeping people at arm's length. She was used to being admired for her wealth and beauty, but few ever saw past her polished exterior. Most men looked at her with respect, or perhaps even reverence, but there was always something distant about their admiration. With Noah, however, there was no such pretense. At first, it was easy to brush off. He was just another young man working around her estate, just another person in the parade of staff that passed through her life. But then came the evening when everything changed. A storm rolled in unexpectedly, torrential rain pouring down just as Noah finished his shift for the day. He was still working in the garden, trimming some hedges that had grown unruly with the summer heat. When the rain began to fall, he didn't hesitate to continue working, determined to finish what he had started. Seeing him drenched and working under the harsh rain, Natalie felt a strange sense of pity. She had often watched her workers labor through the heat and the cold, but it was different with him. He looked so out of place in the rain, yet there was something endearing about his determination. She called out to him, offering him a place inside to wait out the storm. At first he hesitated, but then he walked toward the back door of the house, wiping the rain from his face. When Noah stepped inside, Natalie offered him a towel and a warm drink. He accepted gratefully, the exhaustion from his long day evident on his face. They spoke casually at first, the weather, his work, nothing of real significance. But the atmosphere between them had shifted, the tension palpable. She felt a stirring of something unexpected and unfamiliar: excitement, a spark that had been missing for so long. As she watched him dry off, there was a quiet moment when their eyes met, and for a brief instant, Natalie saw more than just the landscaper who worked for her. Her feelings were complicated, a mix of curiosity and a desire for something more. He was younger, certainly, and she was his boss, but at that moment, none of that seemed to matter. Noah's presence filled the room in a way that made the walls of her mansion feel a little smaller, a little more intimate. Without saying a word, she knew this was the beginning of something new, something dangerous. They both felt it. What started as a simple invitation for shelter from the storm had quickly evolved into something neither could ignore. As weeks passed, Natalie and Noah's affair deepened. What began as a fleeting moment of connection blossomed into something neither could have anticipated. Their encounters grew more frequent, each one carefully hidden behind the walls of Natalie's sprawling estate. Natalie, who had always prided herself on her control over every aspect of her life, found herself slipping into a world of reckless indulgence. She had always been the one who gave orders, who called the shots, but with Noah, things were different. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of excitement, of something beyond the rigid structure of her daily routine. Noah, on the other hand, was captivated by the lifestyle Natalie introduced him to. For a man like him, from a modest background, her world was intoxicating. He was the son of a landscaper, accustomed to working with his hands and living paycheck to paycheck. But with Natalie, he was introduced to a life of luxury. The mansion's marble floors, the designer clothes, the extravagant dinners at the best restaurants, he had never experienced anything like it. Natalie would treat him to gifts, not just of material value but also experiences he had never dreamed of. A helicopter ride over the city, a weekend getaway at an exclusive resort. It was a world where he was no longer just a worker, but a man of significance. At first, he couldn't help but feel that this was a temporary arrangement, a brief escape from the reality of his life. But as their affair continued, he began to believe in something more. He had fallen for Natalie, or at least the idea of her. She was powerful, successful, and beautiful, a woman who commanded respect. And yet, she was drawn to him, a man with nothing more than his charm and his youth. He began to think that maybe, just maybe, there could be something lasting between them. He imagined a future where they were together, not just as lovers but as partners, where he would no longer have to work for his father's landscaping business but could instead join Natalie in the high life. Natalie, on the other hand, was beginning to feel the weight of the situation. The excitement of the affair had begun to wear off, replaced by a creeping sense of unease. Noah's attention was growing more intense, more demanding. He wanted more of her time, more of her affection, more of everything. At first, it was flattering. He would send her flowers, write her notes, express his love in ways that made her feel desired in a way she hadn't in years. But over time, it became overwhelming. Noah's devotion began to feel like a burden. He wasn't just the charming young man she had brought into her life to add a spark of excitement. He was becoming someone who expected her to be everything he needed. And that was something she couldn't give. She still enjoyed the encounters, the secrecy, the thrill of it all. But she didn't want to give him the keys to her world. She didn't want to lose control. Natalie had worked too hard for too long to build her empire, and she was not about to let a younger man disrupt it. She still saw Noah as a way to escape her mundane life, to experience something fresh and exciting, but she didn't see him as the answer to the emptiness she often felt. The tension between them began to mount. Noah, confused and hurt by Natalie's emotional distance, began to push harder. He started to hint at their future together, asking her to make decisions about what would come next. He spoke of their life together, of running away and living a life of freedom. But for Natalie, these words only deepened her resolve to keep him at arm's length. She didn't want a future with him, not in the way he imagined. The idea of abandoning her life, her business, her wealth, for a man like Noah seemed unthinkable. But despite her resistance, there was a part of her that feared Noah's growing obsession. She knew he wanted more, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep him satisfied with the scraps of attention she was willing to give. Deep down, she knew the situation was becoming dangerous. What had started as an innocent escape was now spiraling out of control, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could maintain the delicate balance between indulgence and destruction. Tension mounted as Noah grew more desperate. The balance that had existed between them for so long, the push and pull of attraction, the dance of power, was beginning to shift. What once felt like a thrilling escape for Natalie was now threatening to become a trap. Noah, with each passing day, became more consumed by his feelings for her, and his demands grew more insistent. He no longer seemed satisfied with the occasional stolen moments and the luxury she provided him. He wanted a future, something permanent. One evening, during one of their secret meetings, Noah made a suggestion that would change everything. He had been talking about his dreams for the future, about a life beyond the one he had known. He spoke of escaping the limitations of his background and stepping into a new world, one where he and Natalie could be together, free from judgment and expectation. But then his words took a darker turn. He proposed they run away together, to leave everything behind and build a life for themselves far from Oakridge. At first, Natalie thought he was joking, a romantic fantasy born from the intensity of their affair. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw the seriousness behind his words. Noah spoke with an intensity that shocked her. He wasn't just in love with her, he was fixated on the idea of their life together. He painted pictures of them living in a secluded beach house, away from the prying eyes of their respective worlds. He envisioned himself not as her lover, but as her partner, equal in every way. For Noah, the idea of their escape was not just about love, it was about power. The power to create a life where he could be more than the landscaper's son, more than the man beneath her. He would be the man who stood beside her, the man who shared her wealth and her status. Natalie was taken aback by the boldness of his proposal. She had never considered running away with him, let alone abandoning the life she had carefully built. She tried to laugh it off, brushing aside the suggestion as the wild idea of a young man infatuated with her. But Noah's persistence began to wear her down. He spoke of it more frequently, bringing it up at every opportunity, his words becoming more urgent with each passing day. In the beginning, Natalie had treated his words as nothing more than a fleeting fantasy. She believed he was just caught up in the excitement of their secret relationship, trying to mold a future that didn't exist. But over time, his insistence began to unsettle her. Noah was no longer the carefree young man who had simply been looking for a good time. He was becoming more calculating, more intense, and his obsession with the idea of their future together grew darker. Natalie, who had always been in control of her own fate, found herself facing a challenge she hadn't anticipated. Noah wasn't going to let this idea go. He had already started making plans, reaching out to people who could help them escape, making arrangements for a life that could be theirs, far away from the world Natalie knew. The thought of it all frightened her. She had never imagined that their affair would escalate to this point. She had wanted a brief escape, not a life-altering decision. At the same time, Natalie's feelings toward Noah had started to change. What had once been a thrilling escape from her own reality now felt suffocating. She could sense Noah's growing possessiveness, his need to control not just her body, but her future. She wanted to pull away, to distance herself from the situation before it became too late, but every time she tried to retreat, Noah would pull her back in. His charm, his youth, and his desperation made it harder to resist. He made her feel needed in a way that her career and social life never could. But despite his growing demands, there was a part of Natalie that still enjoyed the power she held over him. She liked the attention, the way he looked at her as though she was the key to his dreams. She liked knowing that she was the one in control, the one who could make his desires a reality if she chose. But the more Noah pushed, the more Natalie realized that the balance of power was slipping. The games were no longer fun, and the thrill of their secret affair was slowly fading into something darker, something more dangerous. One evening, Natalie received a late-night call from Noah, asking her to meet him at her estate. His voice was tight, edged with panic, claiming that someone had found out about their affair, and he feared the consequences. Natalie, always the rational one, tried to calm him down over the phone. She assured him it was probably just a misunderstanding, that no one would believe the rumors if they were true. But Noah's distress was palpable, his words frantic, and soon he convinced her to let him come over to talk in person. Natalie had always prided herself on her calm, collected demeanor, but as she listened to the edge of fear in Noah's voice, she felt a creeping sense of unease. She had spent the last few months carefully managing their affair, keeping it hidden from her social circle, from her husband, from the people who worked for her. The last thing she wanted was for their secret to be exposed. As she waited for Noah to arrive, she paced the living room, trying to steady her nerves. The grand house, usually a place of refuge, now felt cold and empty, the shadows stretching ominously across the walls. When Noah arrived, he looked even more disheveled than she had expected. His usually calm demeanor had vanished, replaced with an almost frantic energy. His clothes were rumpled, his hair a mess, and his eyes were wide with fear. He claimed that someone he didn't say who had discovered the affair, and that they were threatening to expose everything. He spoke in broken sentences, his anxiety so thick that it was almost palpable. Natalie, trying to keep her cool, reassured him that they could handle it. After all, they had successfully kept their secret for months. But Noah wasn't convinced. His voice shook as he told her that they had no time to waste, that they needed to leave right then, to disappear before things got worse. At first, Natalie was confused. She didn't understand why Noah was reacting so dramatically. They had always been careful, and if someone really had found out, it seemed unlikely they would act so quickly. But Noah was insistent. He begged her to come with him, to leave everything behind. He spoke of running away together, of disappearing without a trace. His words were not just desperate, they were urgent, almost as if he believed that their very lives were at risk. Natalie tried to reason with him, but his words fell on deaf ears. He was beyond listening, consumed by his fear, and by the idea that he had to escape, that they both had to escape. In the heat of the moment, something in Noah snapped. The calm, charming man she had known began to unravel before her eyes, and in his panic he lashed out. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen, the blade gleaming under the soft light of the chandelier. Natalie froze, her heart racing as she realized just how far this had gone. Noah's fear had turned into rage, and in the chaos of the moment he no longer saw her as the woman who had indulged him in their secret affair, but as someone who could stand in the way of his escape. The struggle was brief but brutal. Noah, shaking with a mix of fear and anger, lunged at her. Natalie tried to fight him off, but she was caught off guard, her movements sluggish as her mind tried to process what was happening. The knife pierced her skin, and the shock of it sent her reeling. She stumbled back, trying to regain control, but Noah was relentless, his movements fueled by desperation. In the end, she fell to the floor, gasping for breath, the cold marble beneath her offering no comfort as the world around her began to dim. As she lay there, struggling to hold on to life, Noah stood over her, panting, his face contorted with a mixture of fear, confusion, and anger. He had crossed a line he could never come back from. What had started as a passionate, secretive affair had spiraled into something far darker, something beyond his control. The woman he had once admired, the woman he had thought he could build a life with, was lying on the floor before him, her life slipping away with every breath. In the silence that followed, Noah stood still, unsure of what to do next. The reality of what he had just done began to settle in, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and there was no turning back. He had allowed his obsession and his fear to consume him, and now there was only one thing left to do: cover up his crime. The days that followed were a blur for Noah. His mind raced, the weight of his actions pressing down on him, suffocating him with every breath. The woman he had once been so infatuated with, the woman who had seemed like his ticket to a new life, was gone. He had killed her not out of malice, not out of cold calculation, but out of desperation, fear, and a deep sense of betrayal. The moment the knife had pierced her skin, it had all spiraled out of control. What was meant to be a way out, a way to escape from the looming threat of exposure, had become the catalyst for his undoing. He had no plan for what came next. The idea of running away with Natalie, of starting a new life together, had been his dream, but it was now shattered beyond repair. She was dead, and he was alone, left with the brutal reality of what he had done. The house, once a symbol of the life he had hoped to share with her, now felt like a prison, its walls closing in around him. Panic set in as he realized that there was no easy way out. There were no more chances, no more second opportunities. He had crossed a line that he could never uncross. Noah knew that if anyone discovered what had happened, his life would be over. The police would come, and there would be no escaping the consequences. But somehow, he had to buy himself time to figure out how to cover up the murder. His thoughts were clouded, his mind scrambling for any sort of solution. He tried to act calm, to take a step back and assess the situation, but the fear in his chest made it almost impossible to think clearly. In the hours after the attack, Noah cleaned the house, removing any trace of the crime. He wiped down surfaces, scrubbed the floors, and disposed of the bloody clothes he had been wearing. He had to act fast, and he had to act carefully. The longer he stayed in the house, the more likely it was that someone would notice Natalie's absence, that someone would wonder why she hadn't been seen or heard from in days. He had to make sure that no one would ever know what had happened here. The next step was even harder. He knew he couldn't stay in Oak Ridge, not for long. People would start asking questions, her absence would be noticed, and suspicion would quickly turn toward him. He couldn't risk it. With a sick feeling in his stomach, he began to think about the easiest way to disappear. He had no real plan, no place to go, but he knew he had to leave, and fast. He packed a small bag with the few things he needed: a change of clothes, some cash, and his identification. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get him away from the house for the time being. He had to get out before anyone figured out what had happened. His plan was simple: leave Oak Ridge, start fresh somewhere else, and hope that no one would ever find out the truth. As Noah drove away from the mansion, the weight of his actions began to settle in, but he pushed the thoughts aside. He couldn't afford to think about it now. All that mattered was that he was free, that he had escaped the nightmare he had created. But even as he drove through the darkened streets, a part of him knew that this freedom would be short-lived. There was no running from what he had done. Sooner or later, the truth would come out. And when it did, there would be no escaping the consequences of his actions.